Welcome everyone, my name's Ewan Ferguson and I've been asked to facilitate the 3 aerial firefighting webinars. Again, welcome. I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to them, to their generations past, current and emerging. These aerial firefighting webinars have been run through the National Aerial Firefighting Centre Strategic Committee. They're intended to support more information on a national aerial firefighting strategy for Australia. I just want to remind people about the importance to be COVID smart, to maintain social distancing, and if you're in a room with other people, and the policy says you put a mask on, then please do so. Also, reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and to view a copy of the recording, there'll be a link sent out to all the participants sometime soon after the webinar. We've got a great schedule of 4 presenters today, and feedback we've had from previous webinars has been to try and get as many of the questions as possible. So if we still have questions at 2 o'clock this afternoon, we'll keep going, but we will shut the whole thing down by 2:15. But we made that decision to allow a little bit of extra time for the conversation. On the 23rd of July, in webinar number 1, Matt Plasinski from CSIRO brought us up to date with aerial firefighting research. He was followed by Chief Officer Chris Arnold, who's the chair of the National Aerial Firefighting Strategic Committee. And Chris really set the scene with the challenge, what does tomorrow look like? What's our strategy for tomorrow? The second webinar on the 13th of August, we heard from Phil Hurst from the Australian Aerial Application Association and from Ray Cronin from the Australian Helicopter Industry Association. And it was great to hear those 2 views from the aircraft industry. This, the 3rd webinar, continues the theme of what does tomorrow look like, and it sets the scene for the forthcoming Aerial Firefighting Interactive Workshop on the 17th of September. We've got a total of 185 people from across Australia and the globe who are participating in today's webinar. So far, through the whole process, we've had over 390 people involved. Today's webinar is themed, what does tomorrow look like? And it's an important step in the process towards a national aerial firefighting strategy. There'll be 4 presenters. Richard Older, General Manager of NAFC, will speak on the results of a survey undertaken by NAFC late 2009. Josephine Sterling, also from NAFC, will speak on culture and diversity in fire aviation. Vicky Campbell from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service will provide the view from the field. And then Stuart Ellis, CEO of AFAC, will speak about the steps towards a national aerial firefighting strategy. Firstly, to introduce Richard Older. Richard is the General Manager of NAFC and has around 40 years of experience in environmental management, forestry and fire operations. This includes field-based and operational positions. Before taking over NAFC, he was the Manager of Fire Operations for the Public Land Authority in Victoria. His responsibilities included the provision of information and management systems to support fire management planning and operations. Richard is certified to undertake a number of incident command system roles at bushfires, including Air Operations Manager and Air Attack Supervisor. He's acted as an assessor in these roles. Richard has also led or participated in a number of international missions to provide assistance for the control of large fires, including to the USA and in Europe. He's currently chair of the International Fire Aviation Committee. Welcome, Richard, to speak to the NAFC Aerial Firefighting Survey results.
Thanks, Ewan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you happen to be. And thanks very much for listening and providing the opportunity to share a few thoughts on this issue. So just reinforcing the theme, as Ewan says, what does tomorrow look like? Hopefully not like the jumble that's on the page there, which comes from our ARENA management system. We are aiming to develop a forward-looking national strategy that acknowledges very much where we've come from and where we are, but is very much more focused on where we want to be over, say, the next sort of 5 years. Keeping in mind that things are changing, the climate's changing, the economy's changing, the aviation industry is changing, and we'll see plenty more change, so we want to retain flexibility to deal with that. So just in developing a national aerial firefighting strategy is not necessarily a straightforward thing, but I just wanted to sort of examine some of the key inputs that we would have in developing a strategy. And here's a list of some of the examples. So we're certainly looking for input from what I've called there the accountable authorities. And I think this is a point really worth emphasising, that in Australia, constitutionally, the responsibility for bushfire prevention, protection and suppression is with state and territory governments. So ultimately, anything we are aiming to do here is about supporting those states and territories to deliver service to their communities. And we need to be mindful of that all the way along. So what we're really looking at doing is leveraging national collaboration and cooperation to support the states and territories. We don't want to tread on their toes, if I can put it bluntly like that, in terms of their own strategies for tackling bushfires, but it's leveraging the national experience and leveraging national collaboration where it's appropriate to do that. Obviously, a key input is research. We heard from Matt Placzynski in the first webinar, and I think that confirmed that there is actually a good deal of research going on and a good deal of research behind what we do currently. And of course, that's supported by now in Australia over 50 years of experience in using aircraft to fight and support or to support fighting of bushfires. Since Matt spoke to us, it's just worth noting, I think, or making mention of the fact that the US Forest Service has published a report from a very major study that they've conducted over the last 7 years, the Aerial Firefighting Use and Effectiveness Study. And that report, which you'd be able to find online and Google, is quite instructive. There's a huge amount of data and concepts involved, even though it's a relatively short report. But I think to me, it did reinforce the fact that aircraft have all sorts of different missions in fires, and we need all sorts of different aircraft potentially to suit those missions. But I do commend that particular piece of research to you. Obviously, we need lots of input from the aviation industry, and we did hear from the industry at the last webinar. Community is obviously very important. Evaluations, inquiries, Royal Commissions, obviously over the next few months will be very focused on what the current Royal Commission has to say. All matter of subject matter experts, and that's not just necessarily in aerial firefighting, it includes in things like culture and climate and possibly futurists even, and of course our users. And the users is something that I want to focus on a little bit today, and the user agencies more specifically. So to that end, as part of the process of developing strategy, we did actually undertake a survey of what I'd call high-level users. So these are sort of chiefs, deputy chiefs, senior manager type people in our user agencies. And we undertook this survey in the lead up to actually a workshop that was planned on aerial firefighting strategy in 2019, and somewhat ironically had to be postponed because of bushfire activity, and then subsequently postponed because of COVID activity. Yes, in directing a survey at that level of users, there is some inherent biases in there. We're cognizant of that, but I think nonetheless the responses are quite cognizant. We asked them 13 directed questions. We don't have time to go through them all today, so I'll just touch on a few highlights. Certainly quite instructive. I should just emphasise too, we did give them a chance to update their responses following the the 2019-20 season to see if that had changed any of the perspectives. So the first question we asked, is there actually room for improving the efficiency and effectiveness of aerial firefighting in Australia? And we included New Zealand in that, AFAC being the Australasian Council. Well, no surprise, strong agreement, 96% either agreed or strongly agreed that there was room for improving efficiency and effectiveness, and that in itself is obviously quite instructive. So, more to the point, what are the greatest potential opportunities for improving efficiency and effectiveness? And probably this surprised us a little bit. Coming out on top was improved sharing of resources between jurisdictions, but then no surprises, better analysis of cost effectiveness, better analysis of the effectiveness of resources, and a whole range of responses around training and education. Now, we did provide room for respondents to make comments, and some of the comments were quite instructive, but just some sample comments under that improved resource sharing area, for example, was better sharing across borders, and the cost-effective, better cost-benefit analysis on the investment made in aerial firefighting, then understanding when and where they're best used with the most effect, and under the improved skills and training was really about improved skills of the people who manage, support and supervise aviation operations. Third question we asked, do you think we have the right aerial firefighting capabilities currently available to support firefighters on the ground? And not surprising, perhaps a mixed response in this area, but probably more instructive is the responses to the follow-up question is what changes would you recommend? Now, as you can imagine, we got quite detailed responses here proposing various refinements to aerial capabilities, but it would be fair to say that a key focus was on using aerial capabilities for acquiring information or intelligence to support response activities. Then, even though perhaps not directly related capabilities, the respondents have strayed into the areas of better education of stakeholders and better research. So in particular, things like better education of incident management teams to use aerial resources, and again, research and analysis of firefighting aircraft application were the sort of key comments. We asked a question about how do we ensure that the assets are being used effectively, and particularly in this sort of context of increased focus and scrutiny. Unsurprising, focus on education of stakeholders, focus on more research to make sure that we've got the evidence to support strategy, and again, a key focus on improved skills and training.
About 90 seconds, Richard.
We asked a couple of detailed questions like whether we make the full use of the window of opportunity for aerial firefighting, and again, no surprises that generally people feel that we don't. And again, a couple of sort of instructive questions. We know that firefighting aircraft have operational limitations. Are these well understood? 100% say not really and no. So that provides us with some key direction as well. Or maybe we just submerge Canberra in smoke for a few weeks. As an industry, do we know, measure and report on the true costs? Again, strong response along the no, we don't do that effectively at the moment. And finally, we asked, in your opinion, what does success in aerial firefighting look like? And no real surprises there, but it did introduce a couple of key issues around things like early activation and initiation of use of aerial firefighting resources, improved integration with ground support, and improving, again, bringing up the same themes about improving research and education of stakeholders. So where does that all take us? Well, I guess to some degree, this is a bit of my reflections on the responses. But clearly, not in a priority order, these would seem to be, from our senior users' perspective, the main areas to focus on in going forward. Making sure we've got a fit-for-purpose fleet, the right mix of aircraft. I think we know we need a mix to meet all the possible situations, but it's making sure that we've got that mix right. And that extends to when they're available and how they're available as well. There's clearly a requirement to continue to focus on rapid initial attack, because we know that's where the greatest benefits from the use of aircraft come from.
Winding up.
Understanding the benefits and costs. Strong emphasis on research to make sure we've got the evidence. Strong emphasis on education of users. And you saw a very strong emphasis on the education of the community and managing those expectations. And finally, obviously a very key focus, which we are working hard on now, is the training of our people in agencies who manage, support and supervise the operations. So that's it from me. Obviously, sorry, I should just add, I think there's an overlay of needing proper support systems, ARENA as an example, and an overlay of safety on all of that. That's it from me. Thanks, Ewan. Very quick summary of a complex area. Thanks,
Richard. And no doubt, once the NAFC Strategic Committee has considered that report, that the more detailed findings will be released, but many issues which have been raised there, so thank you. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Josephine Sterling. Josephine has been working on the business side of aerial firefighting since 2014, starting in the DELP Aircraft Support Unit and moving to NAFC in May 2017. Prior to NAFC and DELP, Josephine managed pharmaceutical trial contracts for a large Australian oncology network. Prior to that, Josephine was a merchant banker. Josephine likes matching money to value. She enjoys working in fire and emergency management because she's a nature lover and was once a country kid. And hopefully today, Josephine is going to challenge us by talking about culture and diversity in fire aviation and where we'd like to get to. Over to you, Josephine.
Thank you, Ewan, for that lovely introduction. And I add my welcome to you all. Let's look at what culture might look like tomorrow. When NAFC talks of culture, we talk about the very important culture of safety. But today I wanted to talk about two different points of culture that feel very timely. That is imagining what culture will do under COVID-19 and imagining a diverse and inclusive culture tomorrow. We've all been talking and planning and worrying about how to deliver aerial firefighting this season, but I wanted to take this moment to look at the positive about how our ongoing culture, the way we do things, might be improved by how we've learned to work differently in this pandemic. When we think of aerial firefighting, we think of aircraft, but actually most aerial firefighting happens from behind a desk. Planning, consulting, learning, rigging. You're probably sitting at one right now. Richard mentioned our survey we conducted to learn about what the most pressing needs were, and many of the responses were about the desk work that we do. There are a lot of important desk jobs in our sector, like the glamorous role of business manager. But even for those of you that do work on the fireground or in the aircraft or on the airbase, think about it. How do you spend most of your year at work? With our increasing reliance on aerial intelligence and incident control, does your operational space look like this? Or instead of looking like this? And what does our desk work look like today after the pandemic has forced us to work from home? A bit less like this and a bit more like this. Perhaps we're not quite so beautiful as these stock images, but still. If our work largely happens from behind a desk and our desks can now look more like this, what does it mean for how do we work in the future? In 2020, our conversation about flexible work just got louder. It would be fair to say in this crazy year that any lingering stigma about flexible work has decreased or been removed. We've had to think of different ways to conduct our activities, and in doing so, we've demonstrated productivity, efficiency, and balance. With flexible work, we can reduce barriers to participation, allowing a greater contribution from people with long commutes, people working on other teams, people with disabilities, especially from people who have caring responsibilities, which is mostly women, and I'll come back to that. Flexibility has also been proven to beneficial to workers' health, which is an important focus for our sector. There are many things to work through. We need to keep people connected and make sure we see the contribution of those not in our immediate vicinity. I've heard this effect being described as losing our peripheral vision. Many of us are finding too much work from home difficult and lonely. We Victorians can talk about that. The flexibility I'm talking about here isn't pandemic level work from home. It's about what might happen when we're allowed to move back to our offices. Many agencies have promoted flexible work before now. Others have been slower to embrace the possibilities. Our chiefs are talking about it. Have you thought about how we get that flexibility balance right? If we continue to embrace it, we can make a big difference to culture tomorrow. Our teams will be more diverse, adaptable, much calmer, more productive. Increased flexibility allows a greater participation of women. Increasing the participation of women is a particular challenge for aerial firefighting, and there are several reasons why we need to do that. Firstly, it's a global expectation. The UN's 5th Sustainable Development Goal relates to gender equality, and Australian laws codify it. It's a risk for our members and our industry if equality isn't taken seriously. Secondly, the inclusion and promotion of women is critical to our capability. To have a successful workforce, we just can't afford to miss out on half of the talent pool. We need many different tools in our toolbox. We can't limit the size of our workforce. For example, the working group that NAFC facilitated to update the training framework acknowledges that there is a shortage of accredited staff to fill our rosters. Addressing these gaps will need to involve measures of gender equality. Thirdly, research shows that there are overall productivity gains stemming from diversity. Adding women to all male teams increases the team's intelligence and its decision-making capability. Collaboration, commitment, performance, they all improve by around 50% in gender-balanced teams. We need a greater participation of women to be better at what we do. It's worth mentioning that we aren't alone in this. A quick Google search highlights that the aviation sector generally recognises its remits in recruiting and retaining female staff. The sector has a stated objective to improve this to secure its business in the future, and that's going to be particularly pressing after COVID with the recovery. Other industries outside aviation have long recognised it. I've worked, as Ewan said, in both banking and pharmaceutical sectors, and I have to say they're much further ahead in their inclusion of women. In banking, it doesn't really matter as long as you make money and keep the customer. When I started in fire, for all it being really interesting work, and I'm very happy here, I was a little dismayed at how far behind we are in measures of gender equality. That's improving. In my observation though, our partners in the private sector, the providers of the aircraft we use, are generally further ahead in gender thinking than NAFC and the agencies are. And I commend our industry partners for that and urge you to keep moving forward. I should mention here too that we do need to talk about much more broader notion of diversity and inclusion than just gender, but with only 10 minutes, I'm focusing on gender here. So what are we doing about gender? Well, we have the AFAC Champions of Change Coalition, and one of their initiatives is to increase participation so that at least 40% of the group's members are women. NAFC's groups have a poor track record on this. The table on the left in this screen shows that the percentage is much lower than 40%, and it kind of makes me want to cry. The table on the right shows that the number of staff in accredited aviation roles in Victoria, and I'm sorry, I don't have the national figures, but I understand the story is the same. The good news is that aviation numbers have doubled in 2 years. It's heading in the right direction, but it's still less than 10%, and we have a long way to go. I'm not putting these figures up to name and shame. NAFC's practice, I'm issuing a challenge. Our practice is that we come to you and ask for you to nominate people on those groups. Our activities require rare and specialist expertise, and so it tends to be the same agency experts nominated And we thank you and we value that contribution. But it's not about pushing you out of the way. I challenge you instead, when you're nominating, to apply a broader lens, a gender lens. Who is your current lens hiding? Who else could you put forward with support to be one of the key experts for your agency tomorrow, to improve the makeup of the NAFC groups and reap all those rewards of better culture, better decision-making, performance? And to the women who are listening, keep putting yourself forward. Be part of the decisions that affect you. And pick up that riveter, Rosie. We can continue to support each other because you can't be what you can't see. There are some great initiatives by some of our member agencies to commend. We agree that the aerial firefighting workforce needs to be larger, higher performing, mentally steady, diverse, ready for tomorrow. We need flexibility, and we are very good at that now. And we need gender balance. Flexibility will attract more women, and in turn, including more women, will improve our culture and performance. Finally, we each probably have more personal reasons, and these two are mine, my granddaughters. Edie wants to be a CEO, I imagine, of an aerial firefighting company, and Julie wants to be a unicorn. I don't want anyone to limit their dreams or subtly exclude them by using outdated messages and behaviours. I want them to see what they can be. It's no longer about not letting women in the door. That argument is won and the laws are here. It's not about pushing men aside. It's about our culture. It's about utilising, promoting and championing women to build on our success. So what does tomorrow look like? Well, it's about getting the best workforce to do the best job. And that's the discussion that we need to have now in aerial firefighting. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine, and what a great topic to talk about. Now, I just want to add my support for Josephine and her presentation. My experience, culture is definitely enriched through a diverse workplace. Decision making is improved, and I just want to say that we encourage, we value, and we celebrate points of difference in our workforce, both volunteer and paid. So well done, and thank you, Jose. Our next speaker is Vicky Campbell from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. Vicky commenced with the RFS initially as a volunteer in 1990 and then as a staff member in 2009. Vicky has extensive operational experience in firefighting, including field operations, incident management, air attack supervision, and air operations management. In her current role as Manager Central Coast, she is responsible for the overall coordination of firefighting capability and bushfire risk management across the Central Coast and Lake Macquarie local government areas. Prior to commencing with RFS, Vicky worked as an intensive care paramedic with New South Wales Ambulance, specialising in rescue and special operations for 19 years. Since joining New South Wales Rural Fire Service as a staff member, Vicky has worked in aviation management, the State Operations Centre and operational doctrine prior to her current appointment at Central Coast. I welcome Vicky Campbell to speak about the view from the field. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you, Ewan, and welcome to everyone online today. As indicated, I'm going to do a presentation about what the view looks like from the field, and not only from the actual field itself, but also from an incident management perspective in relation to all the benefits that aerial firefighting bring to our operations. And any time that you look at what does tomorrow look like, it's always important to reflect on the past, and in particular some of the successes and limitations that you've had in the past and how that may shape the future. And I think in going through my slides today, you'll see a number of similarities to other themes that have come up generally. And whilst I come from a New South Wales perspective, many of these themes are obviously consistent right the way across the states. So just in looking at obviously the use of aircraft, I'm going to cover all aspects of firefighting here today. So about preemptive stand-ups of aircraft, the initial response of aircraft, not only as fire suppression capability, but also the use of our rapid area response teams or RART teams for remote areas, and some of the success they've had in bringing those fires under control. Remote area firefighting, interface fires, some of the search and rescue functions that we've used aircraft for, the intelligence and mitigation works, and in particular hazard reductions, burns in relation to mitigation. So if we consider some of the successes that we've had, some of the areas that I've particularly noticed is obviously definitely in initial attack. We've had a program here in New South Wales where we've been monitoring and researching our successes in sending remote area teams early to remote lightning strikes, and we've found a definite advantage to that resource and being beneficial in keeping fires to less than 10 hectares and obviously getting control of them sooner and preventing them becoming larger fires that are obviously quite destructive and quite resource hungry then to manage. But also recently we've had quite a lot of benefit in using firebombing aircraft for initial attack, and possibly this is for me been more evident last season with the amount of major incidents that we had here in New South Wales and the aircraft that were deployed to those incidents and the ability to use those aircraft for new starts. And what we saw was obviously when we could send aircraft and fire trucks at the same time to new starts, the ability to get on top of those again was quite beneficial, and that's something that we need to look at a bit further going into the future. The large air tanker program, and not only the big hitting benefits of those as far as the fire goes, but the ability to build lines and build lengthy lines with short time frames has obviously been of significant benefit to the field and IMTs. Interface firefighting, there's definitely been plenty of success stories, not just last fire season, but for many years when you are on the ground and protecting assets and structures and in the interface. The benefit of aerial firefighting in bringing that fire behaviour down as it approaches and allowing the ground crews to save structures and the like has obviously been very, very definite there. And in the aerial intelligence space, and obviously there's been significant advance in this over the last few years, whether it be line scans, whether it be live streaming of data from the air, whether it be the use of RPAS in that space or just general intelligence from the pilots and aircrew. There's significant benefit there in understanding the fire, what it's doing, and being able to be more effective in the tactics and the strategies that we put in place there. But obviously with all the successes, a number of limitations, which we're all well aware of. Obviously there's aircraft are very beneficial in our aerial firefighting, but there's nothing like boots on the ground to actually extinguish fires, and the need for those boots in the ground, or obviously significant rainfall, which you can't always rely on. So there's still that need to make sure that we've got those ground resources there for the extinguishment. Obviously, any time that you have severe fire weather, you can expect an increase of winds, an increase in temperature, and these same conditions obviously are conditions that limit the ability of aircraft to be able to perform. So it is important from an IC's perspective, specifically, that we have that right mix of aircraft, ground crews, heavy plant and the like, to make sure that we've got all our bases covered in the event of the conditions being such that aircraft aren't able to operate. Smoke limitations, a natural thing obviously with the fires and the impact that has on the ability of aircraft to be able to operate and see their targets. The age-long argument about duty time, and obviously commonly the incident management team will prefer to start aircraft later with a view that they definitely want them available to be working at last light or towards last light, which tends to be a busier time of the day. Then there's obviously the question of, do we lose some effectiveness of those assets in not using them early on in the day, and how we could overcome that. And then there's obviously the daylight hours, and currently most of our aerial firefighting occurs during daylight hours, as we've only got very limited capability in relation to nighttime operations. So then one thing I will say from a field perspective is that communications are absolutely critical to the effectiveness of using aircraft. And for a number of reasons. Number one, obviously, the safety of your crews is paramount, and that communication about understanding the aircraft, understanding where the ground crew are, the ground crew understanding where the aircraft are, absolutely important. The understanding of the aircraft as to what the incident controller's intent is, what the strategy and tactics are, so that aerial support is working in synergy with the ground crews rather than against them, is absolutely imperative. We've all been there with the backburns that we're trying to put in from the field. To have an aircraft come and bomb those backburns is frustrating, to say the least. And obviously the ability to quickly reallocate aircraft when you get other priorities come in, or you need to activate a contingency. The effectiveness of communication there to achieve that is obviously very important as well. So some of those successes and limitations, when we look about what we're looking for in the future, some of these things are from my experiences, and obviously some of them have been reflected through inquiries and reviews, not the least of which are the New South Wales inquiry that's come out this week. So a couple of things, obviously night operations. Currently in New South Wales, we have some capability for night operations, but it's fairly limited. And initial trials were around the aerial incendiary and the intelligence work. Now, obviously, we're looking to move into that firebombing space, and some of the benefits that might bring us with the ability to actually have aircraft that actually can operate into the night with us when we know, and we've seen this fire season, just how operations can continue in the night, and we can have fairly significant fire behaviour in the night. And the benefit of being able to provide that aerial support through the night is obviously significant. Predetermined dispatch. We haven't formally done this in New South Wales, only as a operational capability when we have established incident management teams and dedicated air crews available and allocated to those incidents. But it's certainly something that we're going to have a look at as far as standing up aircraft on significant fire weather and have predetermined situations that they will automatically be dispatched to assist with aerial, with firefighting operations. The use of military resources, obviously we saw this during the last fire season where the military aircraft did get up and step up and involve in the aerial firefighting effort, and how we can best use those and prepare those in the future so that they can integrate with our existing fleet of aircraft and obviously with our operations through the Rural Fire Service. Data sharing is something that obviously there's been a bit of work in the background, but it would be awesome to have some significant improvements in this area. Obviously, Richard showed the picture early on of Arena and some of the heat maps associated with where aircraft are picking up their water from and where they're actually dropping it on the fire. From a field perspective, to be able to view that information and see that information is invaluable as far as understanding exactly where the fire is and what operations are occurring and how fast it's moving and where the helicopters' effort or fixed-wing aircraft efforts are. The integration of Track Plus and AVL. Currently, we track our appliances and now our people through portable GRN radios and an AVL or an automatic vehicle locating system. We track our aircraft through Track Plus. The ability to integrate those and to be able to have the aircraft understanding where our crews are, for the crews to be able to see where the aircraft are, would be obviously of significant benefit to improved operational performance and understanding.
Thanks, Vicky.
The ability of the IC to be able to, or the ability of an IMT to be able to automatically upload maps and incident controllers' intent and incident action plans directly to aircraft would obviously be significant, understanding that obviously there's a fair bit of work in the cockpit of the aircraft, but where we can dispatch aircraft and provide them those details before they even depart the ground and have that understanding and that situational awareness would be significant. So some of those data arrangements would obviously be fairly significant for us. Simulators here in New South Wales, we do have simulators predominantly focused on our remote area teams and our winching and our search and rescue operations. To be able to expand that capability into air attack supervision and even bring pilots on board as far as training, as far as fire operations go, there's obviously some significant value in looking into that capability into the future. RPAS, we have a capability of RPAS here in New South Wales, and certainly last fire season we reaped the benefits of that, particularly in the forward command roles and the ability to instantly see where the fire was and what the activity was to be able to ensure that tactics are appropriate, and the benefit of looking further into those capabilities in the future and what they could bring would be of benefit. And of course, last but not least is obviously research. There's obviously been a fair bit of research already in relation to aerial firefighting, and given the importance these assets provide as far as public safety and obviously the public value for money, certainly there's opportunity there to improve research and make sure that we're providing the best capabilities heading into the future. And that's all from me. Thank you, Ewan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I think your presentation reinforces some of the earlier presentations about the range of services and the fact that the aerial firefighting is actually a service delivery mix, not one particular solution fitting all. So thank you very much, Vicky. Our next speaker is Stuart Ellis, who is the Chief Executive Officer of AFAC. Probably needs little introduction. Stuart is an experienced leader in the emergency management industry. Following a distinguished 22-year career in the Australian Army, he was appointed as CEO and Chief Officer of the South Australian Country Fire Service for 5 years. In 2002, Mr. Ellis established a consultancy company and has been involved in over 20 operational reviews, including the Canberra bushfires, the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission, the Christchurch earthquake. In 2012, he was appointed CEO of AFAC, the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council, the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services in Australia. Stuart is passionate about improving the professional standing of fire and emergency personnel and has a focus on progressing an industry-wide integrated approach to emergency management. Stuart is going to speak today about towards a national aerial firefighting strategy. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Ewan. Thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon to you all. So we're talking about towards a national aerial firefighting strategy. Well, in fact, we're pretty close, and the chair of NAFC, Chris Arnold, has, I think, made a commitment to the Royal Commission that we would provide that strategy to them this month. So that really puts us in the frame, so to speak. So it is well developed. It might come as a bit of a surprise. The last time we had a national aerial firefighting strategy was in 2002, when AFAC was putting the arguments forward to establish NAFC in the first instance. Since then, we've been, if you like, operating in line pretty much with the strategy, but we haven't been articulating it. And that's what really this does here. It lays out what we're doing, and indeed, as I'll describe a bit later on, what we intend to do. So the purpose is really to maximise the benefit of aerial firefighting, to keep communities safe. And we've identified we're going to do it in 2 phases. So we've almost finalised the strategy that explains where we are right now. And then in 6 months' time, we'll finalise phase 2 of the strategy, which, if you like, is a projection where we'll be in 5 years' time. We also have a NAFC strategic framework, which is really guiding the business unit of NAFC, which operates within the broader AFAC umbrella. Okay, so just going on to the aerial strategy itself. One of the things we were keen to do is to detail our firefighting capabilities. And I think people are very aware there's a bit of a obsession, I would argue, perhaps it's too strong a word, but on large air tankers. That's really the measure. If there's a large air tanker, then we're managing the fire well. If there's not a large air tanker present, why not? But we're keen in this strategy to be able to provide information to governments and to the reader about the range of different purposes that we use aerial firefighting, and we've listed those there. So I think that's an important message. And I think the last fire season, which will probably correct me, but we had around 165 services operating. At the height of the season, 11 of those were LAT, but 154 were other services providing those capabilities we've got listed there. So the strategy details that. And then going on to the next slide, we talk about the characteristics of the current fleet, the fact that it's largely an Australian fleet, 90% Australian, and that's not well understood in government or the broader community. Again, I think because of this bias towards large air tankers, the availability of that fleet, but also that a lot of that fleet is quite old, and so we just need to be conscious of that. Benefits. There are a broad range of benefits around speed and weight of attack, which is one of the huge advantages. the ability to concentrate resources in a particular area at a point of time, particularly with the advancements of ARENA, the transparency that's now provided. We can identify where the assets are, and that's tremendously available. And so, excuse the pun, it does provide a helicopter view of our aviation assets. And as we've just been talking about, being able to link those with our ground assets would be a tremendous advantage, and that's an area of development for the future. Management considerations, we detail the existing government's arrangements because both from a state and territory perspective, as Richard identified early on, aerial operations is a state and territory activity, but NAFC provides the sort of backroom coordination, if you like. And so the NAFC Strategic Committee is a subcommittee of the AFAC board. The partnerships we have in place with industry, the aircrew sustainability, training, data, communications, these are all factors that impact on the management. Base infrastructure is another one. Emerging risks and opportunities. I mean, clearly COVID-19 is right up there at the current time, and how we operate aircraft across borders or in operating bubbles out of air bases. That's one of the highest risks we've got. One of the opportunities is RPAS, remotely piloted air systems, night operations. Another challenge is the longer fire season and the implications of that for our aircraft and their availability. The Royal Commission's raised the prospect of, is there the opportunity for a national fleet, and what would that look like, or a national reserve of aircraft, what would that look like? So that's another consideration. There's the financial considerations around leasing. Should we be purchasing? New South Wales has gone down that route with one large air tanker and a number of other aircraft. And so what can we learn from that from a national perspective? And looking at the funding allocation principles and drawing on data to be able to do that. And then we're also looking at the various projects which are listed there, ARENA being one of the most visible, but we're also, with the increase in funding that was announced by the government a couple of months ago, part of that was identified for a resource to risk model, certainly from an aviation perspective, and we think we can potentially use that for other resources. And so that's looking at all the considerations around the risks and the weather and other resources, and where best to allocate that to be a bit of a guidance for decision makers. And then we've got that logistics reporting, the issues around retardant and foam. Can we get better national visibility of where they are? The use of simulation, which previous speakers have talked about, and the LAT infrastructure. So that's all some of the projects we're dealing with there. And finally, to look at the last slide, it's really that second part about where we want to be in 2025, and indeed how we're going to get there. So that's going to be the second piece of work. The first piece, which will be the first National Aerial Firefighting Strategy since 2002, we'll have out quite shortly, and then we'll work on the second piece, focusing on the 2025 focus. And as I say there, the Royal Commission has suggested that potential for a modest Australian-based LAT or VLAT capability. And so that's something which we're looking forward to seeing what's in the final report there. So that's a quick overview of what's coming out with the National Aerial Firefighting Strategy.
Stuart, thank you for that. And it probably needs to be reinforced, the significance of the work that's been undertaken, because it's only by forward looking that you can then develop a proper business case for government to fund. So that work is extremely important. I just want to remind people who are on the webinar, if you've got questions, and we've got one question, if you've got questions, if you put it on the chat facility, and then to the best of my ability, I'll interrogate that and forward on the questions. Stuart, we have had a question from Cam Walker. He's not sure whether he heard it correctly, but the figure of 90% of the fleet being Australian owned, was that what you said? Yes.
Well, I think 90% is certainly sourced in Australia. Richard might be able to pick up the technicality, but essentially it's the large air tankers that come in from overseas, and the remainder of the fleet. So if my figure's right around, the 150 odd services that are sourced from domestic capability. But I might defer to Richard in case I'm misrepresenting that at all.
No, thanks, Stuart. Look, just talking about the NAFC contracted services only at this stage, we'll probably end up with around, we're currently at 153, I would think we'll end up with about 158 for this season. Of those, 17 are sourced directly or based overseas. Ownership's a slightly different question. I'm not sure anybody knows who actually owns an aircraft ever, something to do with banks and things, but yes, 17 are sourced from overseas. They do tend to be the larger aircraft, the large air tankers and the Type 1 or the heavy helicopters.
Okay, thanks. And our panel, so Richard's joined us, Josephine's back on, Vicky's back on, Stuart's obviously there, and we've also have Chris Arnold. Chris is the Chief Officer of the Tasmanian Fire Service, but importantly, he's also Chair of the National Area Firefighting Strategic Committee. So again, reinforcing, if you've got a question, please go onto the chat. Now, whilst I've been talking, we've had a couple of questions come up. From Ray Cronin, my question is for Stuart. As part of the strategy, why does NAFC look at contract some of the fleet all year round with sharing the capability across boundaries? Stuart.
Look, I think that is certainly something, Ray, that in those considerations, we're talking about financial considerations and management considerations. I think that's one of the options that we are considering, and as we've said, we've undertaken it from a purchasing perspective in New South Wales. Is there the opportunity to have longer leases and operate that as well? I think that's something we're certainly looking at, and that's one of the options that we'll be listing.
Thanks, Stuart. Greg Nettleton, who's I think a former chair of NAFC Strategic Committee, he suggests perhaps we should record the number of Australian-sourced aircraft by the prefix VH ... So that's something we might think about. Phil Hurst, a national aerial strategy is a great idea and welcomed by industry. However, a partnership, and that's in capital letters, is a stronger basis and essential foundation stone of a strategy. How can we build this foundation without formal consultation structures across all issues? Stuart, I might just go back to you first and then perhaps ask Chris Arnold to respond to that one. So Stuart first and then Chris.
Yeah, look, I think we do have formal consultation now. We meet with the industry, the NAFC Strategic Committee meets with the industry twice a year, and that's a formalised arrangement there. So I think from a strategy perspective, that's something we also need to consider. And of course, there's a lot of informal discussion and liaison, which has sort of built the partnerships to where they are now. So I think it's closer than we've ever been, but there's certainly more we can do, and Chris may want to add to that.
Chris.
I don't think I can add much more to what Stuart said, Ewan. We have commenced the engagement. I think it's a good thing that we've commenced, and we've made some commitments to continue to engage with the air industry. And I think that is the way forward to, just to make it better for all. It's may not quite form a formal partnership, but I think we've got to get the juices flowing. We've got to understand what industry can give, what the fire sector is interested in. Otherwise, we'll misalign ourselves going forward. And there's a lot of things in the future that I think are exciting prospects with types of capability that we haven't had or haven't been able to consider going forward. And clearly, if there's a supplier and a user, we want those things to line up. So not to have secrets and surprises, we want it to be clear. So for me, it's the way forward, and like I say, that'll I expect will be in the strategy in one form or another.
Thanks, Chris. Now we're coming up for time, but as I indicated, if there are questions, we'd keep going until 14:15. So we'll keep going. Wayne Rigg asked, what do future operations look like with military involvement in air operations? Things like maths have been suggested, seem like a good idea, but how do we find out their effectiveness versus purpose-built aircraft with 5 pilots on board? Military aircraft are maybe best utilised for logistics and transport rather than direct firebombing. Discuss, please. And I might send that one off to Richard, please.
Thanks, Ewan, and thanks, Wayne, for the question. And I think this is probably an issue that will play out obviously in the next few months too, as we see the various outcomes of inquiries, in state-based inquiries in the Royal Commission. Look, first of all, just make the point, we really value the tremendous support that's provided by the Australian Defence Forces. They currently do provide a lot of logistic and other support to aerial firefighting activities, and that was obviously ramped up substantially in 2019-20 season. And particularly being able to use the defence bases and so on for large air tankers and so on it really was fabulous support that was provided. So there's no doubt, I think, that support from the ADF will continue to be a feature in terms of the sorts of jobs that the ADF normally does: logistics support, transport, managing air bases and so on. That's pretty straightforward. Getting into the specialist activities like firebombing, I think, raises a whole range of different issues. And as I say, this will probably play out over the next couple of months. I think I could probably just say that I think experience around the world has shown that if defence resources are to be used for those specialist activities, acknowledging there's politics, constitutional, legislative issues around that as well, then it's very important they're in a position to dedicate the resources to those sorts of activities. Effectively dedicate the resources on a full-time basis so they have the same levels of training, the same levels of integration that any other resources might have. So that's probably the key point to make in that respect. But it's a complex question, a good question, a complex question. Thanks, Ewan.
Thanks, Richard. And stay up there. I've got a question from Kang Yol Lee. He has 2 questions. Firstly, since the aerial firefighting operation is so effective, the Korean government is trying to introduce a helicopter aerial operation even at night. I think it's too dangerous. How about in Australia? Are helicopters and aeroplanes used to do the task after sunset and at night? Richard.
Look, thanks, Ewan. Again, look, great question. I think we're certainly cognizant that the having capabilities that can operate at night for aerial firefighting does open up a whole window, potentially a window of effectiveness. We know that often the conditions are better at night. And from that point of view, a number of agencies in Australia have been trialling firebombing at night. We've got reasonably well established capabilities now for gathering intelligence and mapping and so on at night, but the ability to go firebombing at night and take advantage of those better conditions is a priority for us. So a number of trials have been undertaken. An operational capability has been developed in Victoria, and if I could direct Kengi Lee to Emergency Management Victoria website, EMV website. Just do a Google search there and you'll find some videos of the trials that have been conducted in the state of Victoria here. So I think we will develop that as an operational capability from helicopters. I think it's probably fair to say it will never be something that's rolled out sort of across the country as a capability that we'd expect on all helicopters. It will continue to. It's a relatively expensive thing to do, particular risk management involved. So it will continue to be a bit of a specialist area, but we do see it as an important one to follow, and we do believe it can be done safely, and the trials in Victoria have certainly demonstrated that.
Thanks, Richard. And the next one, I'll go to Vicky, and it's Kang-Yol Lee again with the second question. Secondly, bushfires occur in many areas. What factors determine where fixed wing aircraft are deployed? For example, is it determined by terrain characteristics like farmland, bushland, grassland, mountains or villages? Or is it prioritised in areas where there is a risk of personal injury or property damage? Vicky.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, great question. Obviously, there's a range of factors there that go into the decision on the type of aircraft. Part of it obviously comes down to the capability of those aircraft and the suitability of terrain and what the actual task of the aircraft is. When it comes to general firebombing, certainly when it comes to line building, obviously your fixed wings are the forte there. But obviously your helicopters have significant benefit for specific targets, particularly remote area, and assisting with some of those really specific target areas, and obviously some of that, really hilly terrain. However, it's also about availability of the aircraft. I can tell you plenty of occasions where, my preference may have been for a fixed wing. However, the only aircraft available was for a rotary. So I guess it's a range of factors there about not only the task, but obviously what you have available. And the timeframes that go into the selection of what aircraft that you use.
Thanks, Vicky. Question from Jim Blackmore. Will there be a national approach to aviation specialist training rather than each agency developing their own packages? Richard, I think you're probably the best one for that.
Thanks, Ewan. And the short answer, Jim, is yes. We're actually just in the process of reviewing and revising the national framework for fire and emergency aviation training, which does set out national standards within the nationally recognised training framework that's administered by the federal government. So that's certainly the case. There'll be nationally defined standards, and we would expect a number of the key sort of roles in aviation, such as the probably air attack supervisor, air ops manager, also be picked up in the emergency management professionalisation scheme that AFAC's initiated some years ago, and that will provide a sort of further national overlay as well on those key roles. We're also seeing a lot more, I think, collaboration between the states and territories about the delivery of the training itself. So that will also help improve the standardisation.
Thanks, Richard. And the next one I'll direct to Vicky as well. Vicky, if you don't mind, from Joseph Bandiera. How does the upcoming fire season look like with COVID and aerial firefighting? We will be able to receive LATs and larger type helicopters from overseas. Vicky, I think Queensland and New South Wales and Northern Territory are well into their fire season. Are you able to answer that question in relation to COVID and aerial firefighting?
Look, I can probably answer that question in relation to from the field. Richard may be a better person as far as the interstate arrangements, but certainly we've got a whole new range of requirements in relation to COVID as far as incident management, and obviously aerial firefighting comes into that. And I understand, and once again, Richard may be better to answer this, is obviously there's COVID requirements that have come into the contracts now to make sure that we're compliant, we're safe in the current environment. So, and certainly from our perspective, we will be looking at obviously all aspects of our incident management, including aircraft, and making sure that we're keeping people safe, we're keeping people in operational bubbles as much as we can, and limiting the potential, because as you can imagine, one confirmed case of COVID could take a significant amount of our workforce out. We certainly don't want to see that on any scale. So, but as far as the interstate arrangements and specific contract arrangements, I might defer to Richard there.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. You described the situation well, and Joseph, thanks for the question. We are still bringing in the large air tankers and the Type 1 helicopters from overseas. To say it's not without its challenges would be an understatement. It has been quite challenging, but the first large air tanker has actually arrived in the country. So the Q400 air tanker for Queensland arrived last week and is now in operation. So we're confident we'll get all the equipment out here. But yes, it is a challenging environment, no question about that.
Thanks, Richard. There's a question, can we put up a link to the RPAS webpage? So we'll arrange for that to be put up after the teleconference. Wayne Rigg asked to Joes and Vicky, are we doing enough to address diversity and gender balance in fire aviation, or are we just talking about it and grappling with just how to address it? What else can we do? We might go to Joes first and then back to Vicky.
Sure, thanks, Ewan. Well, we're certainly doing more than we did, and that's really heartening. And I think I've mentioned that in my presentation. Certainly, I was serious when I said that our NAFC groups need to have more female representation. NAFC facilitates the leadership that comes from the states and territories in all that we do, and having more people brought along to those groups and learn the way that happens and bring more women onto those groups, that will filter through into the strategy that we're all talking about today, into the impact into that strategy. Are we just talking about it? I think there are certainly still some sectors that are still just talking about it. I think that's good that they are talking about it, but there's still a way to go. And that's where I wanted to encourage the people who put those nominations up to groups, to the AFAC groups as well, to get that moving, because it is about what we can see, and it's about women getting into the more senior roles to be able to bring those behaviours and those decision-making benefits to those teams.
Thanks,
what do you think, Vicky?
I agree, Jose, and absolutely, you know, there has been some good progress to date, but there's certainly a long way to go in many of those areas.
So thank you very much, Jose and Vicky. And I think there is a long way to go. Thank you for acknowledging that point. Now we're starting to wind up for questions. I've just got a couple to pick up. Cam Smith is seeking some information around the simulation working group. Is that open to engagements from industry? Richard, we might get you to respond to that out of session if that's okay. Tim Verco, there is widespread consensus that fire seasons will be longer and more intense. What's the strategy to make aerial assets more cost effective given the potential for spending money is infinite? And the actual spend is rising faster than the suppression outcomes would justify. You might have meant finite rather than infinite. And following on, how does the recently released interim USDA report on the effectiveness of aerial firefighting assets inform the analysis of cost effectiveness in Australia? I might go to Richard first, please.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim. Some pretty big questions in there that might be the subject of a phone call at some stage. But look, just a couple of quick comments. Yes, the season's longer, more intense, and all the evidence suggests that, and we're conscious of that in developing the strategy. And while our potential to spend money is infinite, the budget certainly isn't infinite. It's very finite, and we're very conscious of that as well. So it's about making sure that we've got the the right mix within, or the most effective mix within the budget. Is my view. In terms of the USDA report, look, my view is, and we still need to analyse this in more detail, that the report that's been produced is useful, but it's actually the data behind it that we need to look at even more closely to see what else we can learn from that 7-year study that had many tens of thousands of deployments looked at. And just to illustrate that, the study identifies mission profiles for aircraft and assigns mission profiles to different categories of aircraft, but it doesn't necessarily, in the current report, tell us whether we're using the right aircraft for the particular mission. But I think further analysis of the data will provide will be more instructive in that sense. Very brief answer to a complex question.
Thank you, Richard. Now, I note whilst we've been talking, the NAFC team have put a link on a news story regarding the night firebombing, and also note that they've put up the link to the NAFC RPAS program, so that might help respond to some of those questions. I'm going to wind up the questions there. Could I, first of all, thank all of the presenters and the panel members for being part of this this webinar session. Could I thank everyone who's dialed in from across the globe? I mean, part of the success of events like this is how well they're patronised, and we really appreciate the fact that you've been able to dial in and take part in it. If there are any unanswered questions, I think we've got them all, but we'll do a double check. And if there are questions that we haven't adequately answered, then we'll put a response onto a link and provide that back to the participants. Thank you to all who have asked questions, who have joined. Thank you to the speakers. Behind the scenes, we have two people, Kerry Lee and Deb Sparks of AFAC. They are the two who have made all the technology work in behind the scenes, and I'd like to personally thank both of you for your commitment and your professionalism. A reminder that this webinar has been recorded. We'll post the recording on a link and provide that to all attendees. And then a final reminder about the interactive workshop on the 17th of September, and there should be work going on in jurisdictions to get ready for their involvement and interaction. I think without any further ado, I thank you all again, ladies and gentlemen, and look forward to perhaps talking to you at a future webinar on aerial firefighting. Thank you very much.